So I've completed all my stitches, and this is the right side of the fabric. I have 3 full peaks and the 2 half peaks. This is the peak that I started with here, and this is my other peak that we will join up with that when we sew it together. So you're going to need your yarn needle and a pair of scissors, and we're going to go ahead, I've already done this, snip your yarn at least 60 if not 70 inches long. This is what we're going to use to sew the hat up the back seam as well as along the peak. So it needs to be extra long, and then just tie that off with your long yarn there. We're going to take our yarn needle, thread our yarn, we're going to take our right side of the fabric up, and we're going to flip over one edge to the other edge. So now the wrong side is showing, right sides are together. We're going to line up the brim. The brim is what we're most concerned about lining up, because this edge of the peak is the very longest middle one. So even though these don't line up at the top, we're going to stitch 2 together and it'll pull them just like these other peaks here. So it's most important that you get your brim lined up. And to do this, we're going to do what is called the whip stitch. So we're going to be going in and over, all the way up, and that's going to give us a nice flat seam, as opposed to using a stitch that goes in and out this way, which would give us a ribbed seam and you would see it. So this is going to lay really, really flat, and you won't even be able to tell where the seam is. It's going to line up perfectly. So what we're going to do is we have our chain here, which counted as a stitch, and this is going off the back of our stitch here. What I have found is if we go one below that top chain there and then into that first stitch, it's really going to line up the bottom of it. So then once you've done that, then we can go in that first chain and then into the next stitch. And we're going to be going into those 2 loops that were created by the half double crochet, not our slip stitch. So just the same way when you work the HDCs going this way, those 2 loops are what we're going to be going through. And on this side, you can see we have a top loop, and then we have the V of the stitch. I would recommend going through the V of the stitch as opposed to this loop. If you go through this loop, it's only grabbing one, and over time it's going to stretch out and you're going to get little holes in the back of your seam. So I found that if you go through these 2, the V right here on this side, and then we're going to go through the 2 loops coming back towards us and pull it around. And you can see there's this loop here that's just going to lay nicely over the edge. We're going to just give it a little tug and go on to the next one. So here's the 2 V's. We're going to go in through the 2 loops of the half double crochet stitches. It's going to kind of loop around, and that's just going to lay. We're going to pull it nice and snug. Give it a little tug. Okay, I'll do another one. Through the V, through the 2 half double crochet loops, and pull it snug. You can do this slowly the first time and make sure each stitch is nice and snug as you go. Don't pull it too tight, but you want it tight enough to where it's not going to leave a hole in the back of your seam. And then you're going to do this all the way up to the last couple stitches, and then we'll be stitching 2 together at the top so those peaks line up perfectly. And that gives that a nice flat look that you can't really tell where the seam is. So I'm going to go ahead and go all the way up this to the last couple stitches. I've stitched all the way up my beanie to the top peaks. I have 2 stitches left on this side. So what I'm going to do is you can see how it's quite a bit shorter. And we're just going to pull that up and we're going to be stitching two together. So we're going to go through this side into the second to last stitch, and then we're going to go through the next one and into the second to the last stitch. So you'll have two stitches on the long row going through one stitch on the short row. And what that's going to do is that's going to pull our peak to the end. And I only have one stitch here left. If you end up with just one stitch, it's not a big deal. Go through this one. And if you have an extra stitch there or another stitch, I must have skipped one back in here, just go through that stitch and then back through that same loop. So it pulls it to make a peak just like these peaks. So now I have about 30 inches left, which should be enough to stitch. We're going to be stitching our peaks together. So we are going to be stitching, let's call this, because this is our half peak here, let's call this peak 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we're going to be stitching 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, 4 to 1. And it's going to end up looking like that. So it'll actually make an X when you turn it inside out. So we're going to start with our peak 1, which is our half a peak that has a seam in it. Because it's a half a peak, and with the small medium you have 7 rows instead of, and the medium large you have 8 rows. So the 8 row one you're probably going to end up right in the middle. This one is a little off to the side because we ended on the 3rd row, not the top peak, if that makes sense. So just take your yarn, get it to where it's to the top, loop it around, you can thread it there. So now I'm at almost exactly the top of the peak here. So we're going to go peak 1 to peak 2. And the same thing, we're going to use a different stitch here. And so instead of the whip stitch, which loops around this way, we're going to go in from wrong side through to right side to wrong side. And we're going to pull that, and this is right at the top of peak 1 and peak 2. And then instead of looping around and going back in this side, we're going to come back in this side on peak 2, back through to peak 1. And this is going to give it a little bit of a different look. It's going to have a ribbed seam on the inside, but on the outside of the hat, it's going to look like it's perfectly folded into each other. So I've gone through here, out here, in this way, and back out that way. So we're going to pull it. So we're going to go through the same side we just came out, peak 1. And you don't have to worry about your spacing too much here because we are working down the peak. We have to work back up the peak as well, so it'll kind of be double stitched. You want to just make sure you're getting through the meat of the stitches here and you're not just grabbing like this one here where it's got just one loop. So you want to make sure you're getting underneath there. Because it's folding it in on the right side of the fabric, if you have a little extra meat on this side here on the inside seam, it's not going to make any difference. So I'm just going to go along all the way to the bottom, back through the side I just came out to that side, and then I found if you go, I came back out, and this is at the very bottom of the peak. I came out this side, I'm going to loop around so it does give me a little loop there, and then I'm going to do the same stitch I just did. So I came out this side, I'm going to go back in the same side and out the opposite side. I'm going to go, I just came out this side, so I'm going to go back in this side, same side I just came out, and out the opposite side. And like I said, spacing, we already went down this once, so it's already pretty secure. You just want to make sure you're going in at about the same height as you went down the peak, going back up the peak. So here I'm coming to the very top, of this one. So peak 1 has been stitched to the side of peak 2. Now we're at the top of peak 2 coming out this side. So we're going to grab peak 3, which is this one here, and we're going to place it right up there. So we're going to stitch peak 2 to peak 3. So we're coming out on peak 2. We're going to go in fairly close to where we came out so we can grab the very top of that third peak out that side, and then we're going to go back in the same side we just came out, and then we're going to be stitching peak 2 and peak 3 together. I'm coming to the very bottom. Oh, got on the table. I'm gonna go, I got room to do one more here before I loop around. So there, I'm at the very bottom. So what I like to do is it came out this side. Instead of going back in the same side I just came out, I'm gonna loop around to the opposite side. So it gives it kind of a little, and then I'm gonna do the same stitch as I just did coming down. So I came out this side, I'm gonna go back in the same side I just came out, and out the opposite side. And then when you're going up, you want to make sure you're doing your stitches about the same height and as much down the same as you did going down the peak, if that makes sense. And I'm coming back to the top here. So I'm coming out pretty close to the top peak here on peak 3. And now I'm going to stitch peak 3 and peak 4 together. So I'm just going to take the peak of 4 and kind of tuck it right in there. And I'm coming out peak 3 right now. So I'm going to go back in pretty close to where I came out. Grab the very top. Grab the very top of that 4th peak. We're going out the 4th peak there. And then we're going to do the same thing. We're going to be stitching down this. So out the 3rd peak, back in the same side we just came out, out the opposite side. You can pull it snug, but not too snug. You don't want it to pull and gather too much because that's not going to give it a very good look there. And I got one more room to do one more. I got one more. Oh, yarn came off my needle. Okay, so I'm at the very bottom here. I'm going to go, I came out the 3rd peak. I'm going to loop around and go in the 4th peak on the opposite side. So I kind of end it with a little loop at the end there. And then I'm going to do the same thing going back up. In the 3rd, out the 4th. I came out here. I'm going to go back in the same side. We're going to do that all the way up. You want to make sure you're going down deep enough into the stitches here that you're not just grabbing one loop. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a hole. We don't want that. And I'm back at the top. I'm actually going to do 2 here so I end up coming out on the 4th peak here. So this is my 4th peak. Came out that, so I'm going to turn it. So now I only have one left, and that would be my 4th peak with the other side of the 1st peak. So I'm coming out the 4th peak here. I'm going to go back in fairly close to where that came out. Grab the very top of the 1st peak. That was our half peak that we joined up the back. We're going to go out this side, back in the same side we just came out, and we're going to do the same thing all the way down, stitching the 4th peak to the 1st peak. Making sure we're grabbing more than just one loop here. And when we work our way back up, we're grabbing about the same as going down. I'm at the very bottom here. I'm gonna go out this end. Well, I think I can get one more. Let's see. There we go. So I'm coming out this fourth one, looping it around, going in the first, and then doing the same thing all the way back up. And I know this looks kind of messy on the inside, but I promise you when we turn it right side out, it is gonna have a nice seam that looks like it's just perfectly folded in. Now I'm back at the top here. I can probably go through the fourth into the first one more time to make that line up good. And then it's personal preference here. You could be done, you could tie it off, or what I like to do is kind of just loop it over and go in between here and kind of make an X to make sure. I'm always worried things are going to come undone. There, and then go from this side to this side, and then we got a nice little, and then you could go through here one more time, and then you could tie it off, and then weave in your ends. And as you can see, so we've made this like little X here, right? So when we turn it right side out, it gives us a perfect top for a non-slouchy beanie. And if you remember us doing just a half peak here, that is so when you put the beanie on, your seams here are seams coming right up the back in between where these two pop out. Because when I first had it, I had it just going up right where this would seam together. And when you put it on in the top, it just had one kind of sticking out there. So this way, if you put the seam on, if you put the hat on, the seam will be right at the back of the hat. And then this would be the top here. So these would be on the sides as opposed to one sticking up right in the middle. So there you go. You finished your hat, tie in the ends, and you're ready to wear it.